The people who call you poor are often the same people sitting in a room built by someone else's sacrifice. Lily Carter sat at the private corner table of the Marlowe room, a restaurant so elegant the waiters moved like shadows and every plate looked like it had been arranged with a ruler and a prayer. Warm brass lamps glowed against dark green walls. White tablecloths fell perfectly over polished wood. The air carried the scent of butter, thyme, seared scallops, and quiet money. Beside her, Alexander Hayes sat in a charcoal suit, his wedding ring catching the light each time his hand tightened near his glass. He was 35, a billionaire investor, the heir to Hayes Capital, and the kind of man whose name made bankers return calls before breakfast. But tonight, surrounded by his mother, his relatives, and the woman his family had always wanted him to marry, even Alexander looked trapped. Margaret Hayes sat across from Lily with pearls at her throat and judgment in her smile. Vanessa Blake leaned beside her in a red dress, every movement polished to look effortless. She had been introduced as a family friend, but everyone at the table knew she was the preferred future Mrs. Hayes, the one with the right schools, the right last name, the right kind of wealth. Lily wore a simple navy dress and no necklace. Her hands rested on the linen napkin embroidered with the small gold letter M. She had touched that same letter hundreds of times before, but never like this, never as a wife being treated like a mistake in her own dining room. Vanessa lifted her wineglass and smiled. It must feel strange for you, sitting at the table instead of serving it. A few relatives laughed softly. Not loud enough to seem cruel. Just loud enough to make sure Lily heard. Margaret tilted her head. Vanessa, be kind. Lily is still adjusting. A girl from her background cannot be expected to understand rooms like this overnight. Alexander's jaw shifted. Lily saw it. She also saw that he did not speak. His silence slid between them colder than the silverware. Margaret continued, turning her gaze to Lily's plain dress. At least this restaurant is elegant enough to hide where you came from. Lily looked down at the napkin, at the gold M beneath her fingertips. Marlowe. Her father's name. The name he had painted on the first sign when the restaurant was nothing but 6 tables, a leaking ceiling, and a dream he refused to sell. At the far end of the dining room, the general manager, Mr. Ellis, stood near the wine station. His silver hair was neatly combed, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on Lily. He gave the smallest nod, almost invisible. Waiting. Lily took one slow breath. She could have ended it then. She could have lifted the brass key hidden inside her clutch, called him over, and watched every smile at the table disappear. But timing mattered. Her father used to say a dish served too early loses its truth. So Lily raised her eyes to Vanessa, then to Margaret, then finally to Alexander. You are right about one thing, she said gently. A table can reveal exactly where people belong. Margaret smiled as if she had one. Alexander looked at Lily, suddenly uncertain. And across the room, Mr. Ellis stepped half a pace closer, ready for the moment when the poor wife would stop letting them believe she was poor. 3 months earlier, Lily Carter was not sitting beneath brass lamps while strangers decided what she was worth. She was standing behind the service station at a private investor dinner in Boston, wearing a black apron, low shoes, and the calm expression of someone who had learned that the best way to hear the truth was to be mistaken for invisible. The event was hosted in a glass-walled dining room overlooking the harbor, all candlelight, white orchids, and men in expensive suits speaking in voices soft enough to sound harmless. Lily moved between tables with a tray of sparkling water, refilling glasses, clearing plates, listening without seeming to listen. Alexander Hayes stood near the center of the room, surrounded by investors and family advisors, his charcoal suit perfectly fitted, his smile controlled, his eyes tired. Lily recognized him, of course. Hayes Capital had been circling independent restaurants for months, buying them through quiet partners, turning family rooms into polished brands with no memory. The Marlowe room was next on their list, though Alexander did not seem to know how close his own company had come to her father's legacy. Then a reporter slipped past the host's stand and aimed a question at him like a blade wrapped in velvet. Mr. Hayes, is it true your family is pushing you to marry Vanessa Blake to secure the Blake acquisition deal? The conversations around them thinned. Alexander's expression barely changed, but Lily saw his hand tighten around the edge of his glass. Margaret Hayes, watching from across the room, did not move. Vanessa smiled as if the question pleased her. One wrong answer and the story would belong to them by morning. Lily stepped forward before anyone could stop her, placed a fresh glass of water on the nearest cocktail table, and said with a polite smile, "Mr. Hayes is scheduled to speak about the hospitality fund in 2 minutes, and the host requested no personal questions during service." The reporter blinked. "And you are the person keeping this dinner from turning into tomorrow's cleanup problem," Lily said, still smiling. A few investors laughed. The tension broke just enough for Alexander's communications director to redirect the reporter toward the press area. Alexander looked at Lily, then really looked, as if a waitress had just done what his entire team had failed to do. Later, near the service hallway, he found her stacking empty plates with practiced efficiency. "You handled that well," he said. Lily did not pause. "People behave better when they think the table is still under control." "You always speak to guests like that?" "Only the ones about to ruin dinner." For the first time, Alexander smiled without calculation. Up close, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who had spent years being managed by people who called it love. "What is your name?" he asked. Lily looked at him for one beat too long, deciding how much of herself to give. "Lily Carter." "Do you work here full-time?" "I work where I am needed." It was true enough. Before he could ask more, the executive chef called her name, and Lily stepped back into the service corridor, disappearing into movement, steam, and stainless steel. But as she pushed through the kitchen doors, she felt Alexander's gaze follow her. She also felt the small brass key tucked inside her pocket, warm against her palm when she touched it. The key to the Marlowe room. The key to the one place Hayes Capital could not have. Not while she was still breathing truth into every table her father built. 2 nights after the private dinner, Alexander Hayes found Lily Carter in the last place he expected, outside the back entrance of the Marlowe room, standing beneath a narrow awning while rain stitched silver lines across the alley. She had changed out of her black service apron, but she still looked more at home near the kitchen door than he had ever looked inside his own boardroom. Her hair was pinned loosely, her coat was simple, and in one hand she held a paper bag of leftover bread that she handed to an older dishwasher leaving through the side exit. "For your grandkids," she said. The man smiled like the bread was more than bread. Alexander watched from beside his town car, realizing too late that he was staring. Lily turned and lifted one eyebrow. "Do billionaires usually wait in alleys? Or is this a special occasion?" "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "You already did. You left a tip." "A tip is not a thank you. In hospitality, it is often the closest thing people manage." He should have laughed. Instead, he studied her face, the way she stood with quiet balance, as if the rain, the alley, the expensive car, and his last name all carried the same weight. "I have a proposal," he said. Lily's expression changed just enough to warn him not to choose the wrong words. "That sounds dangerous." 6 months, Alexander said. "A marriage arrangement. Public only. Separate lives. Clear terms. You would be compensated well, and my family would stop forcing the Blake deal through my personal life." Lily did not answer at first. Somewhere behind her the kitchen vents hummed, warm air carrying the smell of garlic, butter, and dish soap. Alexander continued because silence made him feel less powerful than he liked. "My mother believes marrying Vanessa Blake will secure an acquisition and calm the board. I need another option. You handled that dinner better than people who are paid to protect my reputation. So you want to rent a wife the way your company rents banquet chairs." His mouth tightened. "That is not what I meant." "It is what you said with better shoes." The words landed cleanly. Alexander looked away first, and Lily almost respected him for it. Almost. He pulled a folder from inside his coat and held it out. "Read it." "No pressure." Lily took the folder, not because she needed his money, but because the name Hayes Capital appeared too often in conversations about the Marlowe room. If Alexander's family wanted to use marriage as a business weapon, then being close to that weapon might show her where it was pointed. The contract was precise. 6 months. Public appearances. No romantic obligation. Confidentiality. Generous payment. A clean exit. Lily read every line while rain tapped on the awning above them. Then she took a pen from her coat pocket and wrote one sentence beneath the final clause. "My dignity is not part of the deal." Alexander looked at the words for a long moment. You think I would take that from you? Lily met his eyes. I think people with power often take things without noticing their hands are full. The alley went quiet except for the rain. He signed under her line. Not quickly. Not carelessly. Like he understood the sentence mattered even if he did not yet understand why. Lily signed next, her name steady in blue ink. She did not use Carter Hayes. Not yet. Not for a contract that had not earned her truth. As she handed the folder back, the brass key in her pocket pressed against her palm, warm from her body. The key to the restaurant behind them. The key to her father's promise. Alexander glanced toward the back door. You care about this place. I care about places people try to own without loving them. He frowned slightly, not realizing the warning was already about him. His driver opened the car door, but Alexander stayed where he was. Why agree then? Lily stepped out from under the awning, letting the rain touch her sleeve. Because sometimes the best way to protect a table is to sit where they never expected you to belong. Alexander did not understand. Not then. He only watched her walk back through the kitchen entrance, disappearing into light, steam, and the sound of work continuing after the guests had gone home. In his hand, the contract felt like control. In Lily's pocket, the brass key knew better. Lily Carter became Mrs. Hayes on a Monday morning inside a quiet courthouse room with beige walls, a tired clerk, and no flowers except the small white boutonniere Alexander's assistant had placed on his lapel. She wore a simple cream dress she bought herself, because she refused to let Hayes' money dress her for a deal she did not belong to. Alexander wore a dark suit and the guarded expression of a man signing something more complicated than he wanted to admit. When the clerk asked for the rings, his fingers brushed hers for half a second. Lily felt the warmth. She ignored it. Warmth was not trust. 3 days later, she moved into Alexander's penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, where the windows were taller than the walls of her old apartment, and every surface looked too expensive to touch. Margaret Hayes visited before the first suitcase was unpacked. She walked through the living room like she was inspecting damage. Alexander always did have a weakness for dramatic solutions, she said, glancing at Lily's plain coat. Let us hope this one does not stain. Lily smiled. Most stains come from people who spill things and blame the table. Margaret's eyes cooled. Vanessa Blake arrived that weekend with a charity invitation, and a perfume cloud sharp enough to linger after she left. You must be overwhelmed, Vanessa said, looking at Lily's shoes. This world has so many rules. Lily looked at the invitation, then at Vanessa. So does a kitchen. The difference is, in a kitchen, rules keep people fed. Alexander watched that exchange from across the room, his mouth almost moving into a smile before he remembered who was watching. Over the next weeks, Lily attended luncheons, gallery openings, investor brunches, and family dinners where people called her lucky in the same tone they might call a stray dog rescued. She listened. She learned. Hayes Capital was preparing a hospitality fund, one that would buy underperforming independent dining assets and turn them into scalable luxury concepts. The language was polished. The intent was not. In one board dinner, Lily heard Margaret mention the Marlowe Room as if it were already a name on a spreadsheet. Vanessa called it beautiful but inefficient. A cousin said old restaurants were emotional liabilities. Lily sat with her napkin folded neatly in her lap, her wedding ring visible, the brass key hidden beneath the lining of her clutch. She did not correct them. Not yet. Each night after returning to the penthouse, she wrote down what she had heard. Names of holding companies, acquisition timelines, investor concerns, and the quiet pressure Margaret used to push Alexander toward Vanessa's family deal. Alexander noticed the notebook once while Lily sat at the kitchen island in the dark, wearing a sweater instead of silk, her hair loose, a cup of tea cooling beside her. You keep notes on my family? He asked. Your family keeps plans for other people's lives. He leaned against the counter, tired from a 14-hour day. Is that what you think I am doing to you? Lily looked at him then. The honest answer would have been yes. The complicated answer was not always. I think you are standing in a room full of people who call control tradition. Alexander looked away toward the harbor lights. For the first time she saw that the room had trapped him too. But sympathy could not become carelessness. The Marlowe Room was still at risk. Her father's napkins, his recipes, his staff, his name on the door. All of it could vanish beneath a Hayes Capital logo if she blinked too long. So Lily kept playing the poor wife. She smiled when they underestimated her. She lowered her eyes when they wanted proof she knew her place. And every time Margaret spoke about ownership, Lily touched the brass key in her clutch and reminded herself that some truths were strongest when served last. The first time Alexander Hayes truly saw Lily's power, it was not in a boardroom, a ballroom, or any room his family controlled. It was at a charity tasting event hosted in a renovated warehouse near Boston's seaport, where chefs, investors, food writers, and luxury developers gathered beneath exposed brick walls and hanging Edison lights to pretend good taste and good character were the same thing. Hayes Capital had sponsored the evening, and Margaret made sure Lily arrived looking like an accessory rather than a wife. Vanessa floated beside Alexander in a silver dress, explaining wine notes to guests with the confidence of someone who had memorized language but never worked a dinner rush in her life. Lily wore a soft navy dress and stood quietly near the tasting counter, listening as Vanessa described the Marlowe room to a circle of investors. "Charming," Vanessa said, smiling into her glass, "but sentimental. Places like that always need someone practical to rescue them from themselves." Lily felt the brass key inside her clutch press against her palm. Alexander stood beside Vanessa, frowning slightly, but before he could speak, one investor turned to Lily with amused curiosity. "Mrs. Hayes, you worked in restaurants, did you not? Perhaps you can explain the little seafood course they just served." "In simple terms, of course." A few people chuckled. Margaret's eyes gleamed. Vanessa's smile widened. Lily looked at the small plate in front of her. Day-boat scallop, brown butter, celery root puree, preserved lemon, micro-chives placed too late so they wilted under heat. She picked up the fork, tasted once and set it down. "The scallop is beautiful," she said calmly, "but it was seared 30 seconds too early and held under a heat lamp. That is why the center lost its silk texture. The preserved lemon is doing all the work because the puree needs salt. And if this is meant to represent coastal New England dining, the dish should credit the fisherman, not just the chef." The laughter stopped. The chef across the counter looked up sharply, then nodded once, unable to deny it. The investor blinked. "You know food cost as well as flavor?" "Flavor is cost," Lily said. "Waste is cost. Staff turnover is cost. A beautiful room fails when the people running it are treated like disposable decorations." Alexander turned toward her, and this time his expression did not hide behind calculation. He looked stunned. Lily continued, her voice even, not loud, not angry, only impossible to ignore. "If Hayes Capital buys independent restaurants and strips them down to brand elements, you will lose the very thing customers pay for: memory. A restaurant is not just square footage and margin. It is trust repeated every night until strangers feel like regulars." One older investor lowered his glass. "That is the best description of hospitality I have heard all evening." Vanessa's face tightened. Margaret's smile vanished entirely. Alexander stepped beside Lily, not in front of her, and asked the question softly enough that only she could hear. "How do you know all this?" Lily looked across the room at a framed photograph of the Marlowe room hanging among other featured restaurants, her father's doorway reduced to a target in someone else's investment deck. "Because some people study restaurants from spreadsheets," she said. "Others learn them from closing shifts." Later, when the tasting ended and guests moved toward the dessert tables, Alexander found Lily near the service corridor helping a young server balance a tray of espresso cups. "You do that without thinking," he said. "Do what?" "Notice who needs help." Lily handed the last cup to the server and watched her disappear into the crowd. "That is not a skill. That is respect." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "My family thinks service means standing below them." Lily looked at him. "Most people do. Until the person serving them stops." His eyes held hers longer than the contract allowed. Around them the event hummed with wealth, forks, glasses, polite lies. But something between them had shifted. Alexander had married a woman he thought he understood because she wore an apron. Now he was beginning to see that Lily had never been small. She had only been standing close enough to the table to hear the truth. After the charity tasting, Alexander followed Lily to the Marlowe room for the first time without a reservation, a driver, or a business reason he could hide behind. It was close to midnight when his car stopped at the curb, and the restaurant no longer looked like the place investors described in polished decks. The front lights were dimmed. The brass sign glowed softly above the door. Inside, chairs were turned on tables, the bar had been wiped clean, and the last notes of old jazz drifted from a speaker near the host's stand. Alexander expected to find Lily in the dining room. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, wearing a white chef coat over her navy dress and practical black shoes instead of heels, sleeves rolled up as she checked labels on storage containers. The cooks had gone home. The dishwasher waved goodnight. Mr. Ellis counted receipts near the office door. Lily moved through the stainless steel space like every tile remembered her. "You followed me," she said without turning around. Alexander stood near the prep table, suddenly aware that his suit looked useless in a room built for real work. "I wanted to understand." That is a dangerous sentence for a Hayes. She opened a walk-in cooler, checked a crate of herbs, then closed it with her shoulder. "Your family usually prefers to acquire before understanding." He accepted the hit because it was true enough to hurt. "I am not my family." Lily looked at him then. "Not always. But sometimes you let them use your silence like a signature." The kitchen hummed around them, refrigerators, pipes, the settling breath of a restaurant after service. Alexander saw a small framed photo near the office, a younger Lily standing beside a broad-shouldered man in a white apron, both laughing under the old Marlowe sign. Her father, he guessed. The man whose name lived in the gold letter on every napkin. "This place matters to you," he said. Lily took a clean towel and wiped a spotless counter anyway. "People say that like it is sentimental." "Is it?" "No. It is practical." She looked around the kitchen, and her voice softened in a way he had not heard before. "My father built this place with a second-hand stove, a borrowed loan, and a promise to every person who worked for him that no one would be treated like furniture. When he got sick, people told him to sell. When he died, they told me to sell. When I took over, they told me to hire a man who understood business." Alexander went still. "Took over." The words passed through him, but she moved on before he could catch them properly. "So I worked every station. Host stand, dish pit, prep, floor, payroll. I learned where money leaks, where pride helps, where ego ruins a kitchen faster than bad food." He stepped closer but kept distance. "Why not tell people?" Lily gave a small smile. "Because the way someone treats a waitress tells me more than the way they treat an owner." The sentence landed in him slowly, heavy and clean. He thought of Margaret's jokes, Vanessa's smile, his own hesitation, all the little moments he had allowed because they were easier than confrontation. Lily reached up to fix a flickering light above the pass, standing on her toes. Alexander moved instinctively. "Let me. I can do it." "I know." He stopped, then held the small ladder steady instead. She glanced down at his hands, then back at his face. Something quiet shifted between them, not romance exactly, not yet, but respect finding a place to stand. When the light steadied, Lily climbed down and handed him the towel. "If you want to help, wipe the counter." Alexander looked at the towel, then at the billionaire hands that had signed acquisitions, dismissed executives, and never once cleaned a restaurant after midnight. He wiped the counter. Badly at first. Lily corrected him with one raised eyebrow, and he tried again. For the first time in years, no one in the room wanted him to be powerful, only useful. Later, at the back door, Lily locked the kitchen with the brass key. Alexander watched the key turn. He almost asked the question forming in his mind, but she slipped it into her pocket before he could. "Some people inherit buildings," she said, looking at the dark dining room. "I inherited promises." Alexander did not understand everything yet, but he understood enough to know that the woman his family called poor had been carrying a kingdom in her pocket all along. Margaret Hayes did not like losing control of a room, and after the night Alexander wiped a kitchen counter at the Marlowe room, she decided Lily Carter had become more than an inconvenience. She had become influence. 2 mornings later, a cream envelope arrived at the penthouse with Margaret's monogram pressed into the flap. Inside was an invitation to a private dinner at the Marlowe room, written as if it were a family celebration and planned like a public execution. Vanessa Blake would attend. So would 3 Hayes Capital partners, 2 restaurant investors, and the attorney handling the hospitality fund. Alexander read the guest list twice, then looked at Lily across the kitchen island. We do not have to go. Lily poured coffee into a plain mug, calm as rain on glass. Yes, we do. My mother is setting something up. I know. Then why give her the table? Lily looked at him over the rim of the mug. Because sometimes people reveal more when they think the room belongs to them. That evening, the Marlowe room looked flawless. Brass lamps glowed low. The dark green walls seemed richer in candlelight. The embroidered napkins sat folded beside each plate, every gold M shining like a secret. Mr. Ellis greeted the guests with professional warmth, but his eyes found Lily first. She gave the smallest nod. Not yet. Margaret arrived in pearls and certainty. Vanessa entered beside her in ivory silk, touching Alexander's arm as if reminding everyone where she believed she belonged. Lily wore the same navy dress from the first dinner, simple, deliberate, with the brass key hidden inside her clutch. Dinner began beautifully because humiliation often wears perfume first. Margaret praised the scallops, complimented the lighting, and told the investors that the Marlowe room was exactly the kind of legacy property Hayes Capital could elevate. Lily kept her hands folded in her lap. Alexander's expression tightened. The fund has not approved any purchase. Vanessa smiled. Not yet. But once unnecessary emotions are removed from the process, everyone will see the opportunity. A partner laughed politely. Margaret turned to Lily. You must understand that, dear. Some places are too valuable to be left in the hands of people who cannot grow them. Lily looked at the napkin beneath her fingers. Growth depends on what you are willing to cut away. Exactly, Margaret said, pleased. And speaking of unnecessary attachments, perhaps tonight is the perfect time for clarity. The attorney opened a folder and slid a document toward Alexander. A preliminary agreement with Blake Hospitality. A merger path. A clause that would make Vanessa's family essential. A quiet line naming the Marlowe room as a target acquisition through a holding company. Alexander stared at it. Lily saw the moment the trap closed around him. The deal would stabilize Hayes Capital before a rough quarter. It would please the board. It would satisfy Margaret. And it would place Lily's father's restaurant in the hands of people who thought memory was inefficient. Vanessa leaned back, eyes bright. Alexander, no one is asking you to be cruel. We are asking you to be realistic. Then she turned to Lily with a smile sweet enough to rot. Surely you understand. You have worked in places like this. You know owners change. Staff adapts. Margaret added. And if you behave with grace, Lily, there may still be a role for you. Publicly, at least until the 6 months are over. The table went quiet. Alexander looked at Lily, then at the contract. For a breath he hesitated. Not because he wanted to betray her. Because his whole life had trained him to hear opportunity in his mother's voice and danger in his own heart. Lily watched that hesitation, and it hurt more than the insults. She did not need him to save her restaurant. She had already done that. She needed to know whether he had learned anything from standing in her kitchen after midnight. Margaret placed a hand over the acquisition papers. Let us stop pretending. She is a poor wife with a lucky ring. Vanessa is the future this family understands. Alexander stood so quickly his chair shifted back. Enough. Margaret's smile faltered. Sit down. No, his voice was quiet, but every head turned. You do not get to insult my wife to make a bad deal sound respectable. Lily's breath caught, but she did not move. Vanessa's face hardened. Your wife has been lying to you since the day you met her. Margaret lifted her hand toward Mr. Ellis. Manager, please remove Mrs. Hayes from this private room. She is making our guests uncomfortable. Mr. Ellis did not step toward Lily. He stepped toward Margaret. I am sorry, Mrs. Hayes, he said evenly. I cannot remove the owner from her own restaurant. The silence that followed was so complete the candle flames seemed loud. Margaret blinked. Vanessa lowered her glass. Alexander turned slowly toward Lily. Lily opened her clutch, took out the brass key, and placed it on the white tablecloth beside the acquisition papers. The gold key landed softly, but it sounded like a door opening. Lily let the brass key rest on the table long enough for every person to understand that the room had changed owners without anyone moving from their chair. Margaret Hayes stared at it as if a key could be rude. Vanessa's perfect mouth parted, then closed again. The attorney looked down at the acquisition papers and quietly slid one page back into the folder, as though distance might save him from embarrassment. Alexander did not speak. He was looking at Lily with a stunned expression that held too many truths at once. The kitchen after midnight, the way she moved through the dining room, the embroidered M beneath her fingertips, the sentence she had said in the alley about protecting a table by sitting where no one expected her to belong. Mr. Ellis stood beside Margaret's chair, respectful but unmoving. "That is impossible," Margaret said at last. Her voice was thinner now, stripped of its velvet. Lily lifted her eyes. "No, Mrs. Hayes. It is inconvenient. That is different." Vanessa gave a small laugh, sharp and nervous. "You expect us to believe a waitress owns the Marlowe room?" Lily touched the napkin beside her plate, smoothing the gold letter with one finger. "I worked as a waitress here. I also worked host stand, prep, payroll, purchasing, private events, and closing shifts. My father believed no one should own a restaurant without knowing the weight of every job inside it." Margaret turned to Mr. Ellis. "Show me proof." Mr. Ellis nodded once and opened the leather folder he had carried beneath his arm. He placed several documents on the table. The ownership certificate, the transfer papers from Daniel Marlowe's estate, the operating agreement naming Lily Carter as majority owner, and a recent refusal letter rejecting a purchase offer from a Hayes Capital shell company. The investors leaned forward. One of them whispered, "Good Lord." Lily looked at Alexander. "Your fund did not know because the restaurant is held through my father's family trust. Your mother's people knew only enough to want it, not enough to respect it." Margaret's face flushed, but Lily's voice stayed calm. Calm was more powerful than anger here. Anger would let them call her emotional. Calm made them hear every word. "For 3 months I listened to your family discuss my staff as if they were replaceable, my father's recipes as if they were branding assets, and this dining room as if it were a trophy case waiting for a richer name. You called me poor because I served food. But service is not poverty. Service is discipline. It is memory. It is the reason rooms like this function while people like you mistake being seated for being important." The table was silent. Even the nearby waitstaff had stopped moving, not out of fear, but because they were listening. Vanessa tried to recover first. "Alexander, surely you can see how manipulative this is. She married you while hiding ownership of a target asset." Lily turned to her. "And you tried to push a merger that would deliver that asset to your family, while calling me unqualified to sit at dinner." Alexander finally moved. He took the acquisition papers, read the target acquisition line once more, then closed the folder with one hand. "Hayes Capital will not pursue the Marlowe room." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Alexander." No, his voice was quiet, but it carried farther than hers. "Not through this fund. Not through a partner. Not through a shell company. It ends tonight." Lily felt the words land, but she did not let herself soften too quickly. He had spoken, yes. He had chosen, yes. But the wound of hesitation still sat between them, small and sharp. Margaret rose from her chair. "You would throw away a strategic deal for a woman who lied about who she was?" Alexander looked at his mother, then at Lily. "She did not lie about her dignity. We just refused to believe it had value." For the first time all night, Margaret had no elegant answer. Lily picked up the brass key and slipped it back into her clutch. Then she stood. "Dinner is over," she said. Mr. Ellis gave one small nod to the service team. The waiters moved with perfect grace, removing plates that no one had earned the comfort of finishing. Lily looked around the room her father built, at the staff who had stayed loyal, at the man she had married by contract, and at the family who had tried to shame her in her own house. "You may leave through the front door," she said softly. "That is more courtesy than you gave me." The Marlowe room did not close after the Hayes family walked out. It breathed. The staff reset the tables, polished the glasses, and moved through the dining room with the quiet pride of people who had watched their home survive a storm without losing its name. Lily stood near the host's stand after midnight, the brass key resting in her palm, the gold M on every napkin catching the low light like tiny pieces of her father's promise. Alexander remained by the bar long after Margaret, Vanessa, and the investors had gone, his charcoal suit no longer looking like armor, only fabric on a man who had finally realized how much his silence had cost. I am sorry, he said. Lily looked at him, tired enough to be honest and hurt enough not to make it easy. You were sorry before you understood. That is not the same as changing. He nodded because there was nothing to argue with. From inside his coat, he removed the acquisition folder, then the marriage contract they had signed in the rain 3 months earlier. The blue ink line was still there. My dignity is not part of the deal. Alexander tore the acquisition papers first slowly down the center, then again until the clause naming the Marlowe room disappeared into pieces. He did not tear the marriage contract. He placed it on the bar between them. This one is yours to end, he said. Lily stared at the pages. 6 months. Public appearances. Separate lives. Clean exit. It all looked smaller now than the life that had grown around it. Hayes Capital will withdraw every offer connected to this restaurant, Alexander continued. And I will remove my mother from the hospitality fund. That protects your reputation too. Yes, he said. But I am not doing it for that. Lily looked at him for a long moment. Then prove it when no one is watching. She left the ring on her finger that night, but not as forgiveness, as a question. Over the next 3 months, Alexander answered without speeches. He brought in independent advisors to audit Hayes Capital's hospitality investments. He canceled the Blake partnership. He met with restaurant owners his firm had pressured and offered fair exits or full control returns where contracts had been predatory. He created a worker training fund, but placed it under Lily's approval, not his branding department. He came to the Marlowe room twice a week after closing, not to be seen, not to charm her staff, but to learn. He carried chairs, wiped counters, reviewed payroll policies, and listened when line cooks told him what investors never asked. Margaret called it humiliating. Alexander called it overdue. Vanessa disappeared into another polished engagement announcement, and for once, Lily felt nothing but relief. When the 6-month contract ended, Lily met Alexander in the empty dining room before service. Morning light spilled across the tables. He handed her the contract, and signed at the termination line. I will sign if you want me to, he said. No argument. Lily held the paper, then looked at the room, at Mr. Ellis checking reservations, at the young server tying her apron, at the kitchen door swinging open with the smell of fresh bread. I do not want a husband who saves me when the room turns cruel, she said. I want one who helps build rooms where cruelty has no seat. Alexander's voice was quiet. Then let me earn a seat. 1 year later, the Marlowe room opened its second location, not as a luxury chain stripped of memory, but as a training restaurant for people who had been told service work made them small. The first night, Lily stood at the pass in a navy dress, the brass key on a chain beneath her collar, watching students carry plates with nervous pride. Alexander stood beside her, sleeves rolled up, holding a tray of clean glasses. Not above her. Not rescuing her. Beside her. Margaret was not invited to the opening, but a folded white napkin embroidered with M rested at the best table, empty and waiting for anyone who understood respect. When the first guests applauded the young staff, Lily felt her father everywhere. In the bread, in the lamps, in the way every person in the room was seen. Alexander leaned close, careful, still asking permission with every quiet movement. Do I belong at your table now? Lily looked at the man who had once mistaken a contract for control, and had spent a year learning that love was service without humiliation. She placed the brass key in his palm for one breath, then closed his fingers around it with hers. For tonight, she said softly, keep serving.